I didn't even realize something was wrong in my house until I saw a man using a key that was never supposed to exist. That thought kept replaying in my head as I stood in the hallway, staring at the front door of my own home like it belonged to someone else. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 38 years old, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where people wave when they pass by and nothing ever feels like it should go wrong. I had been married to my wife Melissa for almost 8 years, and from the outside, we looked like any other stable American couple: 2 steady jobs, a modest house with a 2-car garage, and routines that made life feel predictable. But predictability has a way of hiding things you don't want to see. It started small, things I told myself didn't matter. Melissa would mention the neighbor, Brian Walker, more often than seemed necessary. At first it was harmless. He helped fix a fence panel, he brought over a tool I supposedly didn't have, he checked on the house when I was working late shifts. I even met him a few times, a polite man in his early 40s with a calm voice and an easy smile. The kind of person you don't think twice about. But over time, the pattern changed. I started noticing his car parked a little too neatly in front of our house, not once or twice, but often enough that it became part of my mental map of the street. I noticed Melissa laughing more when he was around, a kind of lightness in her voice that I hadn't heard directed at me in a while, but I kept telling myself it meant nothing. People drift into friendships like that, I thought, especially in neighborhoods like ours. The moment that changed everything didn't come with an argument or a confession. It came on a Thursday evening when I got off work earlier than usual. The sky was still bright, the kind of late afternoon light that stretches long shadows across lawns and driveways. I remember pulling into the driveway, noticing something out right away. The front door wasn't fully closed. Not wide open, just slightly ajar, like someone had gone in and out without caring enough to make sure it was locked behind them. I stepped inside slowly, expecting to hear the usual quiet of an empty house or maybe Melissa upstairs on a call. Instead, I heard voices. Not loud, not aggressive, just calm conversation from the living room. I walked forward without announcing myself, my shoes barely making a sound on the floor, and that's when I saw him. Brian Walker, sitting in my living room like he belonged there, holding a set of keys in his hand. My keys. Or at least, that's what it looked like at first. But then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There was an extra key on the ring, one I had never seen before. He wasn't rushing, wasn't hiding, just casually turning it between his fingers while talking to Melissa as if this was normal. I stopped in the doorway, and for a moment, nobody noticed me. The air felt heavier, like the house itself had paused. Then Melissa looked up, and her expression changed just slightly, not shock, not panic, just a flicker of something I couldn't immediately name. Brian followed her gaze and saw me standing there. That's when I finally spoke, my voice sounding calmer than I felt. I asked a simple question, one that didn't carry any shouting or accusation, just confusion that needed an answer. I asked how long he had that key. The room didn't answer right away. Melissa shifted in her seat, Brian's hand tightened slightly around the ring, and in that silence, I realized something I couldn't unsee. Whatever was happening in my house, it had been happening without me noticing for longer than I wanted to admit. For a few seconds after I asked that question, nobody moved. It was not the kind of silence that feels empty, it was the kind that feels full of things no one wants to say out loud. I could see Melissa's face carefully controlled, like she was choosing every expression before letting it show. Brian slowly placed the key ring down on the coffee table, as if the weight of it suddenly mattered more than it had a moment ago. I stayed where I was in the doorway, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just watching a scene in my own living room that did not feel like it belonged to me anymore. Finally, Melissa stood up and gave a small smile that did not reach her eyes. She said my name in a calm voice, like she was trying to smooth out something rough before it could cut deeper. She told me Brian had been helping with a few things around the house, small maintenance work, checking on the place when I was at my job. Her words were steady, almost rehearsed, but none of it explained what I had just seen. I looked at Brian and then back at her and asked again, this time slower, the same question but with more weight behind it. How long had he had a key to my house? Brian shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly, and said it was not what it looked like. That was always the first sentence people used when they knew it looked exactly like something. Melissa quickly added that it was only for emergencies, that there had been a situation months ago when I was traveling for work and something needed to be checked inside the house. She said it like it was supposed to sound reasonable, like giving someone a key to your home was the same as lending them a ladder. But the problem was not the explanation, it was the timing, the familiarity, the way Brian sat there without hesitation, like he had been inside this house more than once when I was not here. I stepped further into the room for the first time, not aggressively, just enough to make the distance between us real. I asked Brian directly if he had ever used the key without telling me. He hesitated, just long enough for the answer to matter more than the words he eventually chose. He said he had only helped when Melissa asked, that it was never anything inappropriate, just convenience and trust between neighbors. But every word sounded like it was carefully placed to avoid something bigger underneath. I turned to Melissa again and asked her when exactly she had decided that giving someone else access to our home was something I did not need to know about. For a moment, she did not answer. She looked at the floor, then at Brian, then back at me, like she was trying to find the easiest version of the truth to say out loud. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. She said she did not think it was a big deal at the time, that it started as something small and stayed that way until it did not feel like something worth mentioning anymore. That sentence landed heavier than anything else that had been said that evening. Not because of what it confirmed, but because of what it revealed about how easily boundaries can disappear when nobody is paying attention. I looked around the house slowly, noticing things I had not paid attention to before, small details that suddenly felt different in meaning. The way the air felt slightly disturbed, like routines had been happening in spaces I assumed were untouched. The way both of them avoided looking at me directly for more than a second at a time. I realized then that the question I had asked about the key was not really the question I was trying to answer. The real question was how long had something shifted in my life without me being told it had started shifting at all. And nobody in that room seemed eager to give me a clear answer to that. For a long moment after Melissa finished speaking, I did not respond. I was trying to line up her explanation with what I had just seen, but the pieces did not fit together in any way that felt natural. Brian was still sitting on the edge of the couch, but now his posture had changed, less relaxed, more careful, like he was aware that every small movement might be remembered later. Melissa stood between us and the kitchen, as if positioning herself could somehow reduce the tension in the room. I finally asked Brian to place the keyring back on the table, and show me exactly which key opened my front door. He hesitated again, then slowly separated one key from the rest. It was not a duplicate, I recognized. That was the first clear point where something in my chest tightened, because I had only ever given out 2 copies of my house key, one to Melissa and one spare kept in my desk drawer at work. I asked him where it came from, and he said Melissa had given it to him months ago. I turned to her immediately, and she did not deny it. Instead, she said it had been for emergencies only, that she trusted him to help if something ever happened when I was out of town. The way she said it made it sound reasonable on the surface, but underneath it felt like a decision that had been made without any consideration of how I would feel about it. I stepped further into the living room and looked around slowly, trying to see my own home the way it now appeared through this new information. The familiar space suddenly felt unfamiliar, not because anything had changed physically, but because I now knew someone else had been inside it without my awareness. I asked when the key had first been given. Melissa paused, then said it was around 6 months ago, during a weekend when I was on a work trip in Chicago. I remembered that trip clearly because it had been long and exhausting, 3 days of meetings and late nights, and I had come back expecting the comfort of routine. Instead, I was now hearing that during that exact time, another person had been given access to my home. I asked Brian if he had used the key during that period. He said only once or twice, just to check on things Melissa had asked him to look at, like a minor plumbing issue and a window that was sticking. The explanation sounded structured, rehearsed in parts, like it had been repeated in his mind before being spoken aloud. I could feel my attention narrowing, not toward anger, but toward detail. I started noticing inconsistencies I had missed before. Melissa had never mentioned any plumbing issue to me, not once. I also could not recall any window problem that would require outside help. I asked her directly about it, and she said she did not want to bother me with small things while I was working, that Brian had just been helpful in passing. But the phrase, in passing, did not match the level of access that a house key implied. I looked down at the table where the key ring sat, now resting quietly as if it had always belonged there. I realized the problem was no longer just about the key itself, but about how easily something that important had been introduced into my life without my knowledge. I asked Brian one more question, slowly this time, asking him to be completely honest about how often he had been inside my house when I was not present. He looked at Melissa first before answering, and that pause told me more than his words did. He said he did not keep track, that it was never meant to be frequent, just occasional help. But the uncertainty in his answer created a space that neither of them seemed willing to fill. Melissa finally sat down again, her hands folded tightly in her lap, avoiding eye contact. In that silence, I started to understand that the story I had been told was not a single event, but a pattern of decisions I had not been included in. And that realization changed the way the entire house felt, as if every room now contained questions that no one had prepared to answer clearly. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier ones, heavier in a way that made the entire room seem smaller, as if the walls had quietly shifted closer without anyone noticing. I kept my eyes on the key ring resting on the table, not because it was important by itself, but because it now represented something neither of them could fully explain in a consistent way. Brian finally leaned back slightly, breaking eye contact, and said again that nothing unusual had ever happened, that he had only ever stepped in when Melissa asked, and always for simple reasons. But the more he spoke, the more I noticed how carefully he avoided specifics, never giving exact dates, never naming clear moments, only general phrases that could stretch across months without meaning anything concrete. Melissa eventually spoke again, trying to soften the atmosphere by repeating that it was all just practical, that life sometimes required flexibility, that she did not think I would have objected if I had known at the time. That last part was what stayed with me, because it was not about whether I would have agreed, it was about the fact that I was never given the chance to decide at all. I asked her why she never told me, even once, and she looked down before answering that she did not want to stress me with small issues while I was working long hours. I remember pausing at that explanation, because it sounded reasonable in isolation, but not in context with what I had just discovered. I told her I understood what small issues were, and that giving someone a key to our home did not fall into that category. Brian shifted again, this time more visibly uncomfortable, and said he could return the key if that would make things easier. But the question was no longer about returning anything. It was about how it had existed in the first place without my awareness. I asked him directly if anyone else had ever had access, even temporarily, and he quickly said no, but the speed of his answer made it feel rehearsed rather than certain. Melissa then added that there had been one spare moment when she could not reach me and Brian had helped her get inside after she locked herself out, and that was when the key arrangement began. I asked when that happened, and she hesitated before saying it was sometime in the early spring, though she could not recall the exact week. I found myself silently reconstructing timelines in my head, trying to place my own absence, my own work trips, my own routines against theirs, and what emerged was not clarity but fragmentation. Nothing aligned cleanly anymore. I stood there for a moment longer, realizing that every explanation I was hearing depended on trust one no longer felt secure in, not because of a single action, but because of the accumulation of things I had not been told until I asked directly. Brian finally said he understood if I was uncomfortable, and that he would avoid coming around until things were clearer. Melissa quickly followed by saying there was nothing to avoid, that everything was already normal, but the contradiction between their responses only deepened the uncertainty. I noticed how both of them now seemed more focused on managing my reaction than clarifying the truth itself. That shift changed the energy in the room again, turning the conversation from explanation into correction, as if I were the variable that needed adjusting rather than the situation that needed understanding. I realized then that the real issue was no longer the physical key sitting on the table, but the invisible distance that had already formed long before I had ever seen it. I stayed standing in the middle of the living room long after Brian stopped speaking, long after Melissa tried to smooth the moment into something normal again, because nothing about it felt normal anymore. The keyring still sat on the table like a quiet confession nobody wanted to fully explain, and I realized I was no longer listening to their words in real time. I was replaying them in my head and testing each sentence for consistency. Brian eventually stood up first, saying he should probably head out, and Melissa did not stop him, only nodded in a way that felt too practiced to be spontaneous. I watched him walk toward the front door, and as he reached for the handle, I noticed something that made my attention lock in place for the first time that night. He did not hesitate at all. Not even for a second. He moved through my house like someone who already knew the space, like someone who had done it before without needing to think. When the door closed behind him, the sound felt final in a way that did not match the simplicity of the action. Melissa stayed where she was for a moment, then quietly said she did not want things to feel strange between us, that maybe we were overthinking something that had never been meant to be complicated. I remember looking at her then and realizing how differently we were defining the word complicated. To me, it was not about emotion or discomfort, it was about missing information, about decisions made without shared understanding. I asked her if there were any other things I did not know about, not accusing, just trying to map the boundaries of what had been kept outside my awareness. She gave a small laugh that felt uncertain and said of course not, as if the idea itself was unreasonable. But the confidence in her voice did not match the hesitation I had just witnessed in Brian's answers. I walked over to the table and picked up the keyring again, holding it in my hand longer this time, feeling its weight in a way I had not before. It was not heavy physically, but it carried meaning that kept expanding the longer I looked at it. I asked her to show me exactly which door it was supposed to open, and she pointed toward the front entry without hesitation, but then added that it might also work on the back door if I had changed locks recently, which I had not. That small addition created another gap in the explanation, another detail that suggested more access than had initially been described. I told her I needed to understand how something like this could happen without me knowing, and she said again that it was never meant to be secret, just convenient. But convenience does not usually require silence. I stepped away from the table and looked around the house more carefully, noticing things I had ignored before because I had no reason to interpret them differently. The way certain objects had been moved slightly, the way conversations about maintenance had never included me in decisions that affected shared space. I realized then that the issue was not a single moment or a single key, but the accumulation of decisions that had quietly shifted control over parts of my own home without ever crossing a clear line that I could point to. And in that realization, I understood something I was not prepared for, which was that nothing in this house had changed suddenly. It had changed slowly enough that I had not noticed until I was already standing in the middle of it. After Melissa finally stopped trying to explain things, the house felt quieter than it should have, like the air itself had been reduced to something thinner and harder to breathe through. I remained in the living room, not because I expected anything else to be said, but because I was trying to understand how a place I had lived in for years could suddenly feel unfamiliar in such a short amount of time. Melissa eventually moved toward the kitchen without saying much, leaving me alone with the keyring still on the table. I noticed how ordinary everything looked around it, the couch, the coffee table, the framed photos on the wall, all unchanged, yet somehow no longer carrying the same meaning they had a few hours earlier. I picked up the keyring again and studied it more carefully, noticing small details I had ignored before, like the slight wear on one of the keys that did not match any lock I recognized in my own house. That realization made me pause longer than I expected, because it suggested usage patterns that did not align with anything I had been told. I heard Melissa in the kitchen running water, the sound of routine activity that felt strangely disconnected from the conversation we had just had. I walked slowly toward the hallway and looked down it, noticing how the front door still sat slightly off alignment, something I would normally not think twice about but now could not stop observing. I asked her from the hallway if there had been anything else I should know, anything at all related to Brian or anyone else having access when I was not present. She turned off the water and looked at me for a moment before answering that there was nothing else, just the occasional favor or small help when schedules did not overlap. But the phrasing again left too much space open, too many possibilities without clear boundaries. I stepped back into the living room and sat down for the first time since Brian had left, placing the keyring back on the table but not letting go of the thought that it represented more than just access to a door. I asked her to sit with me, and after a brief hesitation she did. I told her I was not trying to create conflict, but I needed clarity about how often this arrangement had actually been used. She said it was rare, only when absolutely necessary, but when I asked her to define necessary, she struggled to give a consistent answer. That inconsistency made it harder to separate what had been routine from what had been exceptional. I started asking more specific questions, not to accuse, but to reconstruct a timeline that made sense. When had Brian first been inside without me? How many times had he been there? What exactly constituted an emergency that required his access? Each question made the answers slightly less stable, and I could see in her expression that she was trying to balance honesty with comfort, but the two were no longer aligning cleanly. At one point she admitted she had not kept track of exact instances, that it was never documented or counted, which only deepened the uncertainty because it meant there was no clear boundary at all. I leaned back and realized that what disturbed me most was not a single event, but the absence of structure around something that involved direct access to my home. I told her that trust does not usually operate without transparency, and she did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked away, as if the conversation had reached a point where words were no longer sufficient to bridge the gap. In that moment, I understood that I was no longer trying to figure out what had happened on any single day. I was trying to understand how many days I had not been fully aware of at all. The longer I sat there listening to the quiet in my own living room, the more it felt like the conversation had shifted from asking what happened to trying to define what should have been allowed to happen. Melissa stayed seated across from me, her hands loosely folded now, no longer defensive but also no longer fully present in the way she had been at the start of the discussion. I could tell she was choosing her words more carefully, not because she was hiding something specific in the moment, but because she was realizing how many small decisions now looked different under scrutiny. I asked her if there was any written record, any messages, any time logs, anything that could show when Brian had been asked to come over or let himself in. She hesitated and said no, nothing formal like that had ever existed, because it was never meant to be structured in that way. That answer created another gap instead of closing one, because it confirmed that everything had operated on informal agreement, memory, and assumption rather than clear boundaries. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees, trying to keep my tone steady when I asked how often she would estimate it had happened. She looked down for a moment, then said she honestly did not know, maybe a handful of times, maybe more if she was not thinking about it in detail. That uncertainty was not dramatic, but it was unsettling in a different way, because it meant no one had been tracking something that now felt significant. I looked toward the front door again, imagining all the times it might have been opened when I was not home, and I realized I could no longer separate what I assumed from what I actually knew. Brian's earlier confidence now felt different in memory, not because of anything he had explicitly said, but because of how easily he had answered certain questions while avoiding others. I asked Melissa if she had ever been present when he used the key alone, and she said sometimes she was in the house, sometimes she was not, depending on timing and convenience. The word convenience again stood out to me, because it was being used to describe access to something I had always considered private. I stood up and walked slowly toward the hallway, stopping near the front door again, looking at the lock more closely this time as if seeing it from a different perspective might reveal something I had missed before. Melissa followed a few steps behind but did not come all the way into the hallway, as if giving space but also avoiding confrontation with the physical object itself. I asked her if she could remember the exact moment she first decided to give Brian a key, and she closed her eyes briefly before saying it was during a time when she felt overwhelmed with small household issues and thought having help nearby would be practical. That explanation, while calm, now carried more weight because it connected emotional convenience with physical access. I turned the key in the lock slowly, not unlocking or locking it, just feeling the mechanism and thinking about how many times that simple motion could have happened without my awareness. The realization forming in my mind was not about betrayal or accusation, but about the structure of trust itself, and how easily it can become fragmented when decisions are made in isolation instead of shared understanding. I returned to the living room and sat down again, this time not looking at either of them immediately, because I needed a moment to process the fact that nothing I was hearing was a single event, but a pattern of choices that had unfolded quietly over time without ever being clearly defined to me. I sat there for a while without speaking, letting the weight of everything I had just heard settle into something I could actually process rather than react to. The house around me felt unchanged, but my perception of it had shifted so much that every familiar object now seemed slightly displaced from where it belonged in my understanding. Melissa remained in the same spot, watching me cautiously, as if trying to predict what direction my thoughts would take next. I finally spoke again, asking her not about the key this time, but about the nature of trust itself in this situation, how she had made the decision to give someone access to our home without ever framing it as something that required discussion. She took a breath before answering, saying she had not seen it as a decision in the way I was describing it, but more as an adjustment to circumstances that had felt temporary at the time. That word temporary stood out because nothing about what I was hearing felt temporary anymore. I asked her what would have needed to happen for her to tell me, and she paused longer than before, saying she did not know, maybe if it had become more frequent, or if it had ever felt inappropriate. That answer did not bring clarity. It only reinforced that the line she was describing had never been clearly drawn. I leaned back and looked toward the ceiling for a moment, trying to slow down the chain of thoughts forming in my head, because I realized I was no longer just evaluating what had happened with Brian, but trying to understand how many other things in our life might have existed in similar undefined spaces. I asked her if she had ever considered how it would feel from my perspective, not in hindsight, but at the moment the decision was made. She hesitated again and said she had assumed I would trust her judgment, that it had never occurred to her that it would need formal explanation. That sentence created a strange kind of clarity, because it showed that the gap between us was not about a single event but about how decisions were being categorized differently in each of our minds. I stood up and walked slowly toward the window in the living room, looking outside at the quiet street, noticing how normal everything still appeared from the outside world, how no one passing by would ever guess that anything inside this house had shifted at all. Melissa remained seated, not following me this time, and I could hear her breathing steady behind me, as if she was waiting for a conclusion I had not yet reached. I asked her one final question, not about Brian directly, but about whether there had been any other moments where she had felt the need to make similar choices without involving me. She did not answer immediately, and in that silence I realized that the question itself had already changed the shape of the conversation. When she finally spoke, she said there had been small situations, nothing she considered serious enough to bring up, things that were handled in the moment, and then forgotten. That answer did not give me new information, but it confirmed a pattern I had started to recognize, where decisions about shared space and shared boundaries were being made individually, and then absorbed into routine without discussion. I turned away from the window and looked back at her, not with anger, but with a growing awareness that what I had assumed was a shared understanding of our home had actually been operating on two different definitions all along. And in that realization, I understood that the key on the table was not the core issue anymore. It was only the first visible point where I had finally been forced to see the structure that had already been quietly forming around it. The room stayed quiet after I finished speaking, but it was no longer the same kind of silence we had experienced earlier. This one felt heavier, more settled, like something had reached a point where it could not be reversed simply by explaining it differently. I remained standing for a moment, then slowly returned to the couch and sat down again, keeping some distance between myself and Melissa without consciously deciding to do so. She looked at me, but did not immediately speak, as if she understood that whatever came next would not be another explanation, but a shift in how I was processing everything. I finally asked her if she understood why this bothered me, not in a theoretical sense, but in a practical one, the idea that someone could have repeated access to our home without my awareness. She nodded slightly, but her expression suggested she was still viewing the situation through a different framework, one where trust and convenience had blurred into something less structured. I told her that trust does not remove the need for communication, especially when it involves physical access to shared space, and she lowered her gaze before responding that she had not considered it in those terms at the time. That phrase again, at the time, kept appearing in different forms throughout the conversation, as if each decision had only made sense within its own isolated moment rather than as part of a larger pattern. I asked her if she had ever felt uncertain about Brian being in the house alone, even once, and she hesitated before saying she had not thought about it deeply enough to feel uncertain, which in itself was a kind of answer. I looked toward the table again where the key had been, though I did not pick it up this time, because I was beginning to understand that the physical object was no longer the focus of my attention. What mattered now was the structure of decisions behind it, how they had been made, how they had been justified, and how they had been left unexamined until now. I asked her to walk me through the very first time Brian had been given access step by step, without summarizing it or simplifying it, and she took a moment before speaking, as if reconstructing it in real time. She described a situation where she had been locked out briefly, where Brian had helped resolve the issue, and how after that moment it had felt practical to allow him to hold a spare key in case something similar happened again. As she spoke, I noticed how the origin point of this entire situation was not dramatic or intentional, but small and situational, which made it harder to define a clear boundary where it should have been stopped or reconsidered. I asked her if there had ever been a discussion between us about extending that access beyond that initial moment, and she shook her head, saying it had never felt like something that needed formal approval because it was always framed as temporary assistance. I repeated that word again, temporary, and let it sit between us for a moment, because it no longer felt temporary in any meaningful sense. I stood up once more and walked slowly through the living room, observing how unchanged everything looked physically while feeling completely different in context. I realized that what had shifted was not just my understanding of Brian's access, but my understanding of how decisions had been layered over time without being consolidated into shared awareness. And in that realization, I began to see that the true issue was not the presence of a key, but the absence of a shared definition of what access itself was supposed to mean within our home. For a long time after that conversation settled, I remained in a state of stillness that was not peace and not conflict, but something in between where my thoughts were processing faster than my words could keep up. The house around me continued to behave as it always had, quiet appliances in the background, faint street noise outside, the subtle hum of normal life continuing without interruption. But my awareness of it had changed completely, because I could no longer separate what I saw from what I now understood had been happening beneath it. Melissa sat on the couch without speaking for several minutes, her posture calmer now but her attention still fixed on me, as if waiting for a reaction that had not yet fully arrived. I finally asked her a question that had been forming in my mind for some time, not about Brian or the key specifically, but about the nature of boundaries in our home and how they were being defined when I was not present. She looked at me and said she thought boundaries were understood implicitly between us, that not every situation required direct discussion if the intent was practical and harmless. That word, harmless, carried more weight than it should have, because it was being used to describe something I had never been informed about. I asked her if she believed I would have considered it harmless had I been asked directly, and she paused before saying she was not sure how I would have reacted, which was precisely why she had not brought it up. That answer created a loop in the logic that could not resolve cleanly, because it suggested avoidance rather than communication as the governing principle. I stood near the window again, looking out at the street where nothing had changed, and I thought about how many decisions in life rely not on explicit agreement, but on assumed understanding that can shift without notice. I turned back toward her and asked if she realized that what felt harmless to her had still resulted in someone else having physical access to a space I considered private by default. She nodded slowly but did not offer immediate correction or clarification, and in that silence I could sense that the conversation had moved beyond explanation into recognition. I walked back to the table and picked up the key ring once more, holding it longer this time, noticing not its physical form but what it represented in terms of control, awareness, and shared understanding. I asked her if there were any other arrangements like this that had never been discussed, even if they seemed small or temporary, and she hesitated before saying she could not think of anything similar, but the hesitation itself suggested a mental search rather than certainty. I told her that uncertainty was becoming the only consistent element in everything I had heard, because every explanation depended on memory rather than documentation, and every decision seemed to exist in isolation rather than within a shared framework. She did not argue with that observation, which in itself felt significant, because it meant there was no simple correction available. I realized then that what I had been trying to do was not just understand a single situation involving a key, but reconstruct the boundaries of a relationship where those boundaries had never been clearly recorded or enforced in a consistent way. And as I stood there holding the key ring, I understood that the object itself had become less important than the realization that awareness and permission are not the same thing, and that absence of discussion can slowly reshape what we believe we are sharing without either person fully noticing until the change has already taken hold. For a moment after I set the key ring back down, nobody in the room spoke, and it felt as if the conversation had reached a point where language itself was no longer improving clarity, only circling around it. I looked at Melissa and noticed that her expression had shifted again, not toward defensiveness, but toward something closer to exhaustion, as if she was beginning to understand how many layers of unspoken assumptions had been built into what she once considered simple decisions. I asked her directly if she could see why this situation felt different to me now. Not because of the presence of Brian, but because of the absence of any shared awareness around repeated access to our home. She nodded slowly and said she could understand why it would feel unsettling, but she still believed the intention behind it had never been negative. That distinction between intention and impact now felt like the central divide between us. I leaned forward and asked her if she believed intent was enough to justify ongoing access without mutual understanding, and she paused long enough that the silence itself became part of the answer. Eventually she said she had not thought about it in terms of justification at all, which confirmed again that we were not operating from the same framework. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen again, not because I needed anything there, but because movement helped me organize thoughts that were becoming increasingly difficult to hold in place. From there I could still see her sitting in the living room, and I realized how physically close we were while mentally describing entirely different versions of the same events. I asked one more time if there had been any moment, even briefly, where she had considered informing me about Brian having a key, and she finally admitted that she had thought about mentioning it once, but decided against it because it did not feel significant enough at the time. That phrase again, at the time, continued to define every explanation I had heard, and it was beginning to sound less like context and more like a pattern of delayed recognition. I returned to the living room and sat down again, this time not focusing on the key or even on the details of Brian's involvement, but on the structure of decision-making that had allowed all of this to exist without alignment. I told her that what I was struggling with was not only what had happened, but how easily something involving physical access to our shared space could be categorized as insignificant until it was already established. She listened without interrupting, and for the first time, there was no immediate attempt to reframe or soften what I was saying. Instead, she remained quiet, and that quiet felt different from the earlier silences because it did not feel like avoidance, but like recognition that the conversation had reached its real center. I realized then that the key was no longer the subject of the discussion, it had become a reference point for something larger, which was how two people can live in the same space while gradually developing entirely different definitions of what shared responsibility actually means. The conversation had reached a point where nothing more needed to be said immediately, yet neither of us seemed willing to end it, as if stopping would force a conclusion we were not ready to accept. I remained seated, hands loosely together, trying to organize the timeline of everything I had been told into something that resembled consistency. But the more I tried, the more fragmented it became. Melissa sat across from me in silence for a while, then finally spoke in a softer tone, saying she understood why I was unsettled, and that she never intended for anything to feel hidden or improper. I listened without interrupting, but I found myself no longer evaluating her words individually. Instead, I was evaluating the pattern behind them, the repeated idea that decisions had been made in isolation and only later placed into context. I asked her if she understood that the issue was not just about Brian having access, but about the fact that I had been excluded from knowing that access existed at all. She nodded slowly and said she did understand that distinction now, but that it had not felt like exclusion at the time, only convenience. That word again, convenience, appeared like a quiet justification that had been used repeatedly without being examined. I stood up and walked toward the hallway once more, stopping near the front door, placing my hand on the lock but not turning it, simply feeling the physical point where all of this had originated. I asked her from there if she could remember any moment where she considered that I might see this differently from how she saw it, and she paused before saying she had assumed it would never become something I would need to think about at all. That answer lingered in the air longer than the sentence itself, because it revealed not avoidance, but a complete separation in perspective about what required shared awareness. I turned back toward her and asked if she now understood why that assumption mattered more than the action itself, and she did not respond immediately, which felt like the first moment in the conversation where no explanation was available at all. I returned to the living room and sat down again, noticing how tired the space felt, as if the weight of repeated clarification had changed the atmosphere of the room itself. I told her that I was no longer focused on proving intent or assigning blame, but on understanding how many other parts of our shared life might have been handled in the same way, without discussion, without alignment, without mutual awareness. She looked down and admitted that she could not say for certain there were others, but she also could not confidently say there were not, which in itself confirmed the uncertainty that had been building throughout the entire conversation. I realized then that what I had been searching for was not a single answer about a key or a neighbor, but a reliable framework of shared understanding, and that framework was now something I could no longer assume existed in the way I once believed it did. There was a long pause after that, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but instead feels full of everything that has already been said and everything that can no longer be unsaid. I remained seated, no longer trying to force the situation into clarity, because I had reached a point where clarity itself felt incomplete rather than helpful. Melissa sat across from me, her hands resting still in her lap, no longer attempting to explain or defend anything, just present in the space between us. I finally spoke again, but this time my voice was slower, not because I was uncertain, but because I was no longer trying to resolve the conversation in real time. I told her that I understood what she had intended, but that intention was no longer enough to define what had actually been created between us through these decisions. She nodded slightly, but did not interrupt, and I continued by saying that what had changed was not a single event, but my understanding of how decisions had been made without shared awareness over time. I asked her if she could see that this was not about Brian anymore, not about one key or one moment, but about a pattern where important information existed in one person's understanding but not in both. She looked at me for a long moment, and said she could see it now, but that she had not seen it before in the same way, because she had never thought of small decisions accumulating into something larger that would eventually require alignment. That admission did not resolve anything, but it clarified the gap more precisely than any explanation before it. I stood up and walked slowly toward the front door one last time, not to check it or examine it, but simply to be near the point where this entire realization had begun. I placed my hand on the doorframe and thought about how many times something can feel normal simply because it repeats without interruption. When I turned back, Melissa was still seated, and I could see in her expression that she was processing the same realization in her own way, though from a different angle. I told her that I was not making a decision in that moment about the future, but that I needed time to understand what it meant to live in a shared space where awareness had not been fully shared. She did not argue or attempt to change that statement, and instead simply nodded, acknowledging it without trying to shape it. I returned to the couch and sat down again, this time not trying to analyze every detail, but allowing the full pattern to exist in my mind without forcing it into immediate resolution. What I understood clearly at that point was that the key, the neighbor, and every explanation given were not isolated problems, but symptoms of a larger absence of communication boundaries that had gone unaddressed. And as I sat there in the quiet of the house, I realized that the most important shift was not about discovering what had happened, but about recognizing that shared understanding is not assumed, it is continuously built, and in this case, it had not been built together in the way I had believed it was.